East Anglia has for centuries been at the forefront of agricultural technology that has increased productivity and commercialised the industry. The region has seen many major advances in agricultural technology, crop production and in soil management, particularly how soil structure and fertility is managed. By the early 19th century, soil chemistry had become better understood, particularly the big three soil nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Farmers looked for ways to improve the NPK status of soils, usually through organic fertilisers. There was particular interest in how soil phosphates may be improved, as the main source by the early 19th century was bone meal, which was in short supply in the UK and had to be imported. In 1841, a German scientist, Justus von Liebig, found that it may be possible to synthesize superphosphates from bones using sulfuric acid, producing a potent chemical phosphate fertilizer. But the main problem was still a shortage of bones. What was the answer? A chance discovery was to provide that answer, and led to Suffolk becoming the progenitor of an agrochemical industry that transformed world agriculture. Which brings us to these cliffs in Old Felixstowe. Now they are fronted by coastal defences, but in the 19th century they were actively eroded by the sea. The nearest approximation to this today would be the cliffs at nearby Bordsey. In 1842, a chap named John Stevens Henslow was taking his holidays in Felixstowe. Yes, even by the 1840s, Felixstowe was a holiday destination for those who could afford such, and by that I mean the wealthy, of course. John Henslow was Professor of Botany and Geology at St John's College in Cambridge, but had considerable interest in many scientific disciplines that included mineralogy, geomorphology, archaeology, paleontology, agriculture and chemistry. He was one of the most eminent and well-connected scientists of his age, and helped shape scientific discovery in the 19th century. One of his best-known protégés was Charles Darwin, who filled in for Henslow on a scientific voyage to the Galapagos Islands in 1831 on HMS Beagle. Quite typical for this part of the 19th century, Henslow was also an Anglican clergyman and theologian, and was awarded the living of the parish of Hitcham in Suffolk, which he held from 1837 until his death in 1861, at the same time retaining his chair in Cambridge. Henslow also had the knack of seeing how scientific discovery may have social and industrial benefits, and was very influential and well connected with the academic and industrial community of that time. As you might imagine, Henslow didn't exactly lay on the beach at Felixstowe and take in the rays. He went exploring. As a geologist, he busily mapped the local cliff strata for anything interesting. And interesting was what he found. And it revolutionised agriculture. And that discovery was a layer of nodules in the old Felixstowe cliffs in the local geology known as Red Crag. These nodules looked remarkably like what geologists call coprolites, nodules of fossil dinosaur poo that had been initially discovered by his friend Dorset geologist William Buckland in the 1830s. Henslow found that his coprolites were plentiful and high in phosphates. It was already known locally that these nodules, when crushed, improved soil fertility, but Henslow was a person who put everything together, aware of Liebig's work in Germany, and speculated that this could be a source of superphosphates if someone could develop an industrial process to economically process coprolite. This led to a race in the next couple of years to develop commercial superphosphate production. Further surveys showed that coprolite patches were common in many areas of Red Crag in the surrounding areas, as well as other locations in Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. An irony of Henslowe's discovery was that red crag was laid down in a shallow sea in the Pliocene era between 5 and 2.5 million years ago, well after the time of the dinosaurs, and that the phosphatic nodules found were the undifferentiated remains of marine animals, but they were still called coprolites, even though they were certainly not fossilised dinosaur poo. Henslowe's research spread fast. John Bennett Laws, a farmer from Hertfordshire, was the first to apply Liebig's process to coprolite and extracted superphosphates. A Suffolk chemist and businessman, Edward Packard from Saxmundham, was also trying to extract superphosphates from coprolite and found Hoare's method better than his, and so he adapted it and opened a superphosphate factory in 1847 on the quay in Ipswich. It was a world first, the commercial production of an artificial fertiliser from an inorganic source, that's coprolite, which was in plentiful local supply, and it was the start of a revolution in agricultural productivity. Superphosphate production in Ipswich boomed as competitors, small and large, established in Suffolk. These included two branches of the Fison family, James and Joseph Fison of Thetford, and also the Prentice family of Stowmarket. All were involved in manufacturing agricultural products and got into superphosphates. James Fison set up a plant alongside Packard's in Ipswich. The area, now known as the waterfront, transformed the port into a congested industrial district which spewed sulphurous smoke all over the town. Most early superphosphate producers were initially small factories or mills, but it became clear that there were two companies that were scaling up and subsuming the smaller ones. Of course, those were Packard and Fison. It rapidly became clear that to scale up it would be necessary to look outside the town for production facilities. In 1853, Edward Packard decided to build a new factory out at a rural site in Bramford. It had considerable advantages for expansion and diversification into other chemical products, as it was close to the then navigable River Gippin, but more importantly was next to the Eastern Counties Railway, so that coprolite from newly discovered sources in places like Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire could be transported there. Before long, Fisons also moved to Bramford and set up next door to Packard's. The development of the site at Bramford eclipsed competition from other superphosphate companies in Suffolk and beyond, and Packard's took over Prentice of Stowmarket as the company expanded. Both Packard's and Fisons also retained production facilities in Ipswich and moved product from the port. The exploitation of coprolite had a significant effect on the rural landscape around Felixstowe and Ipswich. There were many who prospected for coprolite and paid farmers to extract it. Fields in many parishes became pockmarked with crag pits. Concentrations of nodules were found in Old Felixstowe, Trimley, Curton, Levington, Falkenham, Newbourne and Bordsey. The vast majority of pits opened were backfilled and returned to agriculture. Not only was coprolite extracted from crag pits, but usually there were solid box stones and sand deposits which could be used for building. The few remaining coprolite pits are not accessible to the public, usually for safety or scientific reasons, and are also on private land. Most coprolite in the Felixstowe area had been worked out by 1880, and it's now almost impossible to find any coprolite pits in the Red Crag here. The last time anyone found coprolite in the cliffs at Felixstowe was in 1942, so if you plan to go and look, forget it. When local coprolite was exhausted, it was brought in from the other counties which had developed local production of phosphates, but these were bought up or outcompeted by larger companies, including Packard's and Fisons. Up until the end of the coprolite boom, how did those extracting coprolite get it from villages around Felixstowe to Ipswich and later Bramford? Most of the local coprolite was moved to the rivers on carts and then loaded on sailing or steam barges to Packards or Fisons. Curtain coprolite was loaded at Felixstowe Ferry, whereas Trimley and Levington coprolite was loaded at this small quay for transport on the Orwell. Where quays didn't exist, coprolite was taken to barges from beaches by smaller flat-bottomed boats called lighters. The coprolite boom was incredibly short, as UK coprolite was exhausted by 1900. This didn't mean a decline in production of superphosphates at Bramford, as materials started to be imported, such as guano from South America and from ores discovered worldwide. Business boomed at Bramford as Packards and Fisons both diversified their agrochemical products. The scale of production also ramped up as both companies improved manufacturing techniques. Early manufacturing of phosphates entails separate mills for crushing the coprolite and for the production of sulfuric acid. A huge site at Bramford allowed for scale production. In 1866, James Fison built the first purpose-built, fully integrated fertiliser production plant at Bramford, another world first for Suffolk. But changes were afoot for Suffolk fertiliser production, as both domestic and worldwide competitors started to challenge the dominance of Suffolk fertiliser production. The two competitors were forced to work together during the First World War, and in the 1920s they merged to become Edward Packard and Joseph Fison Thetford Limited, which became known as just Fisons Limited in 1942. The company expanded and diversified into a multinational player in the agrochemical sector. But this is far from the end of the story. Let's go back to where the story of the fertiliser revolution started in 1842. By the early 1950s, Fisons was seeking to find new office premises in or around Ipswich, and chose to buy a landmark hotel in Felixstowe, which had hit on hard times. The Felix Hotel, a landmark Jacobean-style building standing on the Red Crag cliff top. In 110 years, the Suffolk chemical fertiliser story had come full circle. The company that was a pioneer in artificial fertiliser production was moving into the town where the story started, an irony that was not lost on the company. In 1952, Harvest House became the HQ for Fisons' fertiliser division. The company also opened a research station at Levington. I'd like to say that for the Suffolk agrochemical industry it was happy ever after, but sadly no. The Fisons story in Felixstowe ended abruptly as globalisation in the agrochemical industry resulted in an overseas takeover of Fisons by Norsk Hydro of Norway in 1982. Harvest House closed and the building was sold in 1984, becoming converted into retirement flats. The research station at Levington was also closed, and although another company still has horticultural research facilities and has acquired the old Fisons Levington compost brand, the main building is now occupied by a representative of Felixstowe's massive new industry, containerised shipping. Norsk Hydro sold the pharmaceutical and scientific instrument arm of Fisons to Roan Poulenc in 1995. The former Fisons fertiliser arm has remained with Norsk Hydro, and the company is now called Yara International and still based in Norway. So what remains of the Suffolk fertiliser revolution today? As far as coprolite extraction is concerned, there's very little left to show of the crag pits that once pocked the landscape around Felixstowe. Most workings had vanished without trace even before accurate mapping of the area arrived in 1881. Unless you know where to look, you'll never know this was a major area for mineral extraction. The fate of the fertiliser production facilities has been much different. In Ipswich, the old buildings at the waterfront are now long gone and replaced by the university, restaurants, bars, leisure boating and private flats as part of the regeneration of the area. The only evidence of fertiliser manufacture is in the unusually named Coprolite Street, which marks the site of Edward Packard's superphosphate factory. The site of the fertiliser factories at Bramford has remained derelict since closure in 2003. The general plan has been to clear and decontaminate the site prior to the construction of housing, for which planning approval was initially given in 2014, but nothing transpired and the site remains derelict. Finding someone who's willing to take on this very complex brownfield site has been difficult because of the unique and historic Fisons fertiliser plant of 1866, because the North Warehouse in particular was Grade 2 listed as being of national importance. Even in its derelict state in 2017, it was an impressive structure and had been earmarked for community use, but its scale and structure would have entailed massive investment to bring it into economic use. You'll notice that I've used the past tense. In 2019, the mainly wooden building was mysteriously completely burnt down. Arson was blamed. Rumours circulated. It wasn't the first historic building in Suffolk that met its end in a controversial fashion, but probably it was the most significant. This is all that remains. The future of the site remains uncertain as of the date of this video. The fate of Harvest House in Felixstowe has been much happier. In the 1970s, the company did try to demolish part of the historic building to redevelop it as a modern office block, but this was blocked by the government and led to the building's eventual preservation. It remains an iconic survivor, not just of one former use, but of two. Ask anyone in Suffolk what Felixstowe is famous for today, and most will say it's port, with all the containerised shipping and associated activities. Some will say that it's a traditional seaside resort that is becoming revitalised. But how many will say Fisons or fertiliser? Few these days. For Felixstowe and Fisons, the story is over. A piece of history that's still living history for some, but is unknown to the younger generation and to incomers. Back in Bramford, the end of the fertiliser story is still being written in the ashes and dereliction of the huge Fisons site. I hope it has as good a legacy as its seaside neighbour, but that's a story that's still to be written.